The Pacific Ocean conceals one of history's darkest secrets, buried nearly 3 miles beneath the waves. For 83 years, it lay untouched, unseen, a monument to imperial pride and military ambition that ended in catastrophic flames. On June 5, 1942, in the early morning darkness, the Imperial Japanese Navy's flagship, Akagi, slipped beneath the surface with over 200 souls still trapped in her iron hull. She sank bow first into the abyss, her massive steel frame collapsing into the crushing depths, and there she remained, lost to time, lost to history, until October 2019, when sonar operators aboard the research vessel Petrel made an astonishing discovery. They had found her. But it wasn't until September 2023, when the most advanced underwater exploration equipment ever assembled descended into that lightless void, that humanity finally laid eyes on what remained of the Akagi. And what they found was absolutely terrifying. The footage came streaming back to the surface in real time, pixel by pixel, image by image, revealing a warship so violently destroyed that even experienced wreck explorers were left speechless. The hull was peeled open like a sardine can. The flight deck had been literally torn from the ship and flipped upside down, exposing the internal skeleton of the vessel to the frigid darkness. Gun barrels lay scattered across the seafloor, detached from their mounts. Sections of the hull had massive voids blown straight through them, where secondary explosions had ripped the ship apart. And there, still etched on the bow after more than 8 decades of corrosion and decay, the imperial chrysanthemum, the symbol of the Japanese emperor, remained visible. A haunting reminder of the power that had once commanded the Pacific. This is the story of that discovery. This is the story of how underwater drones finally unveiled the horrifying truth of what happened aboard the Akagi on that fateful day in June, when the entire balance of World War II shifted in the span of just minutes. The Akagi was not just any warship, she was the crown jewel of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Commissioned in 1927, she represented the cutting edge of naval engineering and served as the flagship of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, one of Japan's most brilliant military minds. For years, she had dominated the Pacific unchallenged. She participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, striking fear into the hearts of American naval commanders. She was involved in operations across the Indian Ocean, spreading Japanese military power across the vast waters of Asia. The Akagi was seemingly invincible, a symbol of Japan's determination to control the Pacific and reshape the geopolitical order of East Asia. But then came Midway. The Battle of Midway would turn out to be the turning point of the entire Pacific War, and the Akagi would be at the center of that cataclysmic collision between two great naval powers. On June 4, 1942, as dawn broke over the Pacific Ocean, the Akagi was positioned at the heart of Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's Kido Butai, the mighty first carrier striking force. This was the most powerful naval task force the world had ever seen. 4 of Japan's largest fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soyu, and Hiryu, were arrayed for what was supposed to be another overwhelming victory. American naval forces were supposed to be crippled, isolated, and easily defeated, but American intelligence had cracked the Japanese naval code. The Americans knew exactly where the Kido Butai would be. They had positioned 3 of their own carriers, the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, in a massive ambush. What was supposed to be a Japanese triumph became a catastrophic disaster. The morning air was suddenly filled with the roar of aircraft engines and the terrifying whistle of falling bombs. At approximately 10:26 in the morning, as the Akagi's flight crews were still preparing their own aircraft for launch, American dive bombers from the USS Enterprise screamed down from the sky. The squadron was led by a legendary American pilot named Richard Best. 28 dauntless dive bombers came diving out of the clouds, their engines screaming, aimed directly at the Akagi's flight deck. The Japanese anti-aircraft gunners tracked them frantically, but in those chaotic seconds, evasion was nearly impossible. The sky itself seemed to explode with ordnance. 3 separate bombs struck the Akagi, with one massive 1,000-pound bomb hitting near the midship elevator at the exact moment when aircraft below decks were being armed with fuel and ammunition. The explosion that followed was apocalyptic. The single bomb detonation triggered a catastrophic chain reaction of secondary explosions as the armed aircraft below decks ignited, fuel lines ruptured, ammunition magazines exploded one after another in a nightmarish cascade of destruction. The flight deck erupted in towering flames that climbed hundreds of feet into the air. Thick black smoke poured from the ship's superstructure, obscuring the sky. The heat was so intense that it drove the crew from the bridge within minutes. Admiral Nagumo, recognizing the catastrophic damage, ordered the evacuation of the Akagi at 10:45. The crew began abandoning ship, descending ladders, and jumping into the cold Pacific waters as their ship burned around them. But the Akagi did not sink immediately. Instead, she burned through the entire night of June 4th, her massive hull still afloat, still burning, flames consuming everything combustible on her decks. Smoke signals from the dying carrier could be seen for miles across the ocean. The ship's engineering spaces deep below decks became furnaces. The water mains, damaged by the near-miss bombs, could not be repaired. The crew's desperate attempts to fight the fires proved utterly futile. As dawn broke on June 5th, it became clear that the Akagi was beyond any hope of salvage. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant strategist who had conceived Japan's entire Pacific strategy, issued an order to his staff with genuine emotion. He told them that he had once been the captain of the Akagi, and that it was with heartfelt regret that he must now order his beloved ship to be sunk. Japanese destroyers, the Arashi, Hagikaze, Maikaze, and Nawaki, maneuvered alongside the burning hulk of the Akagi. At 5:20 in the morning on June 5, 1942, they simultaneously fired their torpedoes. The massive warship shuddered as the explosions detonated along her hull. Slowly, inexorably, the Akagi heeled over to one side, her bow rising into the air, then plunging down into the depth. She sank bow first, diving deeper and deeper until she crashed onto the seafloor at a depth of over 18,000 feet, nearly 3 miles below the surface of the Pacific. 267 crew members perished in the disaster, fewer than on the other Japanese carriers that were sunk that day, but still a catastrophic loss of life. And then she was gone. The Akagi vanished into legend, into history, into the realm of might-have-beens and roads not taken. Japan's moment of dominance in the Pacific had ended. The balance of power had shifted irreversibly toward the United States, and the Akagi, once the flagship of Japan's pride, became a tomb suspended in the crushing darkness of the abyss where no human had gazed upon her remains for more than 80 years. The wreck should have been impossible to find. It lay in the middle of an enormous expanse of open ocean, 1,300 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor. The waters in that region are extraordinarily deep, and sonar mapping technology would have to be extraordinarily sophisticated to locate a single ship hull on the seafloor of such vast depth. But in October 2019, a research team aboard the Petrel vessel operated by the Vulcan Institute and dedicated to locating and surveying historic shipwrecks was conducting a mapping expedition through the region known as the Papahanaumo'akea Marine National Monument. This area, protected as a sacred space by both American and Japanese interests, is also the location of numerous World War II shipwrecks. The Petrel's crew was using high-frequency sonar to map the region in detail. They had already found the Kaga just days before. The sonar operators were scanning the seafloor, watching for anomalies, for shapes that didn't match the natural geological features of the ocean bottom. And then suddenly they saw it, a massive target. The sonar return matched the dimensions of a large aircraft carrier. The distance from Pearl Harbor matched the known location where the Akagi was reported to have sunk. The size and shape matched the hull configuration of the Akagi, a converted battle cruiser with distinctive lean lines. It had to be her. Rob Kraft, the director of undersea operations for Volcon Inc., confirmed the discovery officially. The Akagi had been found at a depth of 18,011 feet. Exactly where she was supposed to be, exactly where Admiral Yamamoto's last order had sent her to the bottom of the Pacific. But the sonar image alone could only tell them so much. The Petrel was not equipped for a full underwater survey at that depth using remotely operated vehicles. The equipment would have required extensive preparation and a longer mission timeline. So the Akagi remained visually unseen, her condition unknown, her true state a mystery, that would have to wait for more advanced exploration technology to arrive. That technology came in September 2023, when the research vessel Nautilus, operated by the Ocean Exploration Trust and funded by NOAA, arrived in the region with the most sophisticated underwater exploration equipment ever assembled at that time. The Nautilus carries the Atalanta, a remotely operated vehicle capable of descending to depths of several miles while carrying high-definition cameras, manipulator arms, laser scanners, and other sophisticated sensors. So on September 10, 2023, the Nautilus team began the descent toward the Akagi. The operation took hours. The Atalanta, tethered to the surface by a fiber optic cable that transmitted power and data, descended slowly through the darkness, following a predetermined grid pattern. As it descended, the water grew colder, the pressure increased exponentially, and the darkness became absolute. 3 miles down, there is no trace of sunlight. The water is as black as the inside of a stone. The only light is the harsh glare of the Atalanta's powerful LED lights, piercing through the darkness like a searchlight through fog. And then, gradually, the outline of a massive object began to emerge from the blackness. Metal. Rust. Corrosion. The shapes of human engineering distorted and broken, but still unmistakably a warship. The Akagi was coming into view. The first thing that struck the operators was the sheer scale of devastation. This was not a ship that had sunk in relatively good condition. This was a ship that had been utterly annihilated. The flight deck, which would have been the most prominent feature on an intact aircraft carrier, was barely visible in places. In other places, it was completely gone, torn away by the violence of the explosions and the impact with the sea floor. The hangar spaces below decks were exposed to the ocean, vast empty cavities where Japanese aircraft had once been stored and prepared for launch. As the Atalanta maneuvered through the wreckage, the extent of the damage became increasingly apparent. The hull itself had been peeled open in massive sections. On one side, a section of the hull was literally blown outward, torn away by secondary explosions, leaving a void so enormous that the Atalanta could be positioned to look directly through the ship from one side to the other. The metal was twisted and warped, frozen in the moment of catastrophic mechanical failure, and everywhere, on every surface, every edge, every crevice was the rust, the corrosion of 81 years of being submerged in salt water at crushing pressure. The gun emplacements that studded the Akagi were in various states of destruction. Some of the 127mm dual-purpose gun mounts remained in their correct positions, their barrels still intact, pointing out at an ocean that would never see them fire again. Others had been torn apart, their barrels ripped from their mounts by explosion or impact, lying scattered on the sea floor like the broken bones of some ancient marine creature. The smaller 25mm anti-aircraft gun tubs were similarly damaged, some preserved better than others, but all showing signs of the intense heat and violence that had consumed the ship. Superstructure, the island, the command centers, the fire control systems, was in catastrophic condition. The whole structure had largely collapsed, twisted and torn by the fires that had swept across the Akagi before she sank. The stairways that had allowed the crew to traverse the ship were buckled and broken. Portholes, which would have provided both ventilation and light to the interior spaces, hung open like empty eye sockets. A bridge, where Admiral Naguma had stood just hours before abandoning ship, was simply gone, obliterated beyond recognition. But as the Atalanta continued its meticulous survey, recording every detail in high-definition video and still images, something extraordinary began to emerge from the horror. Despite the devastation, despite the 81 years of corrosion, despite the crushing pressure at such an extreme depth, the Akagi had preserved certain features with remarkable clarity. The bow, relatively protected from the worst of the fires and explosions, remained in surprisingly good condition. The overall shape of the hull was still recognizable. The armor belt that had ringed the ship's waterline was visible, and most astoundingly, the imperial chrysanthemum, the Mon symbol of the Japanese emperor, was still visible on the bow, etched into the metal, faded and corroded but unmistakably present, still marking the ship as property of the divine emperor. The stern of the ship had preserved the section where the Akagi's name had been painted. It was visible now, the paint standing out stark white against the rust, having held up remarkably well through the decades. This fresh white paint, it seemed, had been applied near the time of the ship's sinking, and it had protected the underlying metal from the worst effects of corrosion. The anchor that had once hung ready to drop from the Akagi's bow had broken free, falling away into the mud of the seafloor, but still remaining close to the wreck, marking the spot like a monument. And most extraordinarily, in one location on the flight deck, the Atalanta's cameras had captured what appeared to be intact wood, actual wooden planking that had survived 81 years underwater, preserved perhaps by the lack of wood-eating organisms at such extreme depths, or by some quirk of pressure and temperature that prevented decomposition. This footage, as it streamed back to the surface through fiber optic cables back to the scientists aboard the Nautilus, was processed through the most advanced 3D imaging technology available. The still images were color-corrected using Adobe Photoshop. The digital data was transformed into three-dimensional models using specialized photogrammetry software. Each pass of the Atalanta, each survey run following the grid pattern, added new information. The researchers built up a complete three-dimensional digital replica of the wreck, a ghost ship that could be examined in perfect detail from every angle, rotated, measured, analyzed with millimeter precision. The mosaic of images created by this process was extraordinary. It revealed not just the wreck as it was in that moment of documentation, but told the story of how the Akagi had met her end. The damage patterns showed where the bombs had struck. The twisted metal revealed the patterns of the explosions. The missing sections indicated where the heat had been most intense. Every scar on the hull, every twisted piece of metal, every torn seam told a story that had been waiting 81 years to be read. What emerged from this analysis was a picture of utter destruction more complete than even the worst expectations. This had not been a ship that had been lightly damaged and then scuttled to prevent capture. The Akagi had been utterly destroyed by the violence of combat. The bomb hits from Richard Best's dive bombers had ignited fires that had consumed everything combustible aboard the ship. The secondary explosions from armed aircraft had torn the structure of the ship apart from within. The Nermis bombs had damaged the ship's critical systems, rendering her unable to save herself. And finally, the torpedo strikes from the Japanese destroyers had administered the coup de grace, finishing the destruction that combat had begun. The footage from the Atalanta was haunting. It was the visual representation of an empire's death throes. It was the final resting place of over 200 young men who had died aboard the Akagi as she burned and sank. It was the physical manifestation of the moment when the tide of the Pacific War had turned, when Japanese hopes for dominance had been crushed, when the outcome of the war had fundamentally shifted toward the inevitable American victory. that would come 3 years later. The images showed a warship that had once been magnificent, now twisted into unrecognizable shapes by forces of such violence that they were almost incomprehensible. The Akagi, flagship of the Imperial Japanese Navy, pride of Japan's military establishment, had become a grave marker, a monument to the futility of militarism and the terrible costs of war. And for the first time in over 80 years, humanity had finally witnessed what remained of her in the crushing darkness of the abyss. But what happened on that morning was not a singular event. It was not just the Akagi that was destroyed. In the span of mere minutes, 5 fateful minutes to be exact, the entire balance of power in the Pacific shifted irreversibly. 3 Japanese fleet carriers were fatally damaged within a window of time so short that pilots who had launched from the second carrier had no idea that the first carrier had already been hit. The Kaga, Soryu, and Akagi all suffered catastrophic damage virtually simultaneously, struck by coordinated dive bomber attacks from the USS Enterprise and the USS Yorktown. And this would be followed hours later by the destruction of a 4th carrier, the Hyuru, in a desperate and ultimately futile counterattack. But the Akagi was the flagship, the symbol of Japanese power, the ship that Admiral Yamamoto himself had once commanded. When she burned, something burned with her. When she sank, something sank with her. The psychological impact on the Japanese leadership was instantaneous and profound. The victory that had seemed assured just hours before was transforming into catastrophe. The 4 carriers of the Kido Butai, the Japanese first carrier striking force, were supposed to be invincible. They had dominated the Pacific for 6 months. They had attacked Pearl Harbor with impunity. They had seized vast territories across Southeast Asia and the South Pacific. They were the spearhead of Japanese imperial ambitions, the instruments through which Japan would establish hegemony over the entire Pacific Ocean and force the United States into a negotiated peace that would leave Japan as the dominant power in East Asia. And in 5 minutes, that entire plane died. The Kaga, positioned elsewhere in the Japanese task force, was struck by bombs from the same dive bomber squadrons. The impact of the first bomb tore through her flight deck, but the real disaster came from the secondary explosions. The Kaga, like the Akagi, had been in the process of rearming and refueling her aircraft. The hangar decks were packed with planes, fuel, ammunition, and ordnance. The bombs ignited all of it simultaneously. 40 tons of explosives stored in her magazines detonated in a cascading sequence of explosions that literally tore the ship apart from within. Fire spread so rapidly and with such intensity that the crew could not control it. Thousands of sailors were trapped below decks in the boiler rooms and engine spaces, unable to escape as the fire consumed the compartments around them. 811 men died aboard the Kaga, most of them killed not by the initial bomb strikes, but by the uncontrolled inferno that consumed the ship and the suffocating smoke that filled the compartments where they were trapped. Her surviving crew members, who made it back to Japan, were immediately restricted to an air base in Kyushu and kept incommunicado for 1 to 2 months, held in complete isolation to prevent any word of the Midway defeat from reaching the Japanese public. The Soryu was hit simultaneously with the other 2 carriers. Bombs tore through her flight deck, igniting the aircraft and fuel stored below. Like the other Japanese carriers, she had been caught in the worst possible configuration for damage control. Fully armed, fully fueled, with the crew distributed across multiple compartments in the process of preparing for the counterattack. The explosions cascaded through the ship, destroying the compartments where the sailors were stationed, killing so rapidly and so completely that many of the crew never even knew what had struck them. 711 officers and men died aboard the Soryu. Her captain, Ryusako Yanagimoto, had the terrible choice of abandoning ship or going down with his vessel. He chose to remain aboard, lashing himself to the anchor to await the end as his ship burned and eventually sank beneath the waves. But the Japanese did not stop fighting. Even as 3 of their 4 carriers burned and sank, the 4th carrier, the Hiryu, was preparing a counterattack. This was the defiant last stand of the Japanese carrier force. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding the Hiryu, ordered an attack despite the overwhelming evidence that the battle was already lost. The Hiryu launched her dive bombers at the USS Enterprise and her torpedo bombers at the USS Yorktown. The American carrier Yorktown, which had already been damaged earlier in the battle, was hit by several bombs and 2 torpedoes in this Japanese counterattack. The ship was crippled, her fires raging out of control, her crew forced to abandon ship as she lay dead in the water. But the Japanese victory was hollow. The Yorktown, despite being abandoned and left to drift without power or steering, would eventually be saved by the American fleet. And more importantly, the location of the Hiryu had been revealed by her own attack. American dive bombers from the Enterprise, including pilots who had already sunk the Akagi and the Kaga, turned their attention toward the Hiryu. 4 massive 1,000-pound bombs crashed through her flight deck in a series of accurate and devastating strikes. The Hiryu burned just as fiercely and just as completely as the other carriers. Admiral Yamaguchi, refusing to abandon ship, remained on the bridge and went down with his vessel when she finally sank. By the end of June 5, 1942, 4 Japanese fleet carriers lay at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen had died. The Japanese had lost the overwhelming majority of their naval aircraft and the irreplaceable cadre of experienced pilots who had trained before the war. The fleet that was supposed to dominate the Pacific had suffered a catastrophic defeat from which it would never fully recover. The entire strategic plan that Japan had built for the conquest of the Pacific had been shattered. And the United States, far from being defeated, was now positioned to take the offensive and begin the long process of island hopping across the Pacific that would eventually culminate in the invasion of Japan itself. This was the true significance of Midway. This was why the wreck of the Akagi 81 years later still had the power to captivate and terrify, because the Akagi's destruction was not just the loss of a warship. It was the point at which the tide of the entire Pacific War turned. It was the moment when Japan's window of opportunity closed forever. It was the pivot point upon which the entire history of World War II in the Pacific balanced. The underwater explorers aboard the Nautilus understood the significance of what they were seeing. As the Atalanta's lights illuminated the twisted wreckage of the Akagi's superstructure, as the cameras captured the bent and broken gun mounts, as the 3D models were built from the thousands of still images, the team was witnessing the physical manifestation of a historical turning point. They were seeing the last resting place of the moment when Japan's dominance ended and America's counteroffensive began. They were documenting the grave of an empire's highest hopes. The photogrammetry process that transformed the still images into a 3-dimensional digital model was extraordinary in its precision and detail. The team had extracted 9,097 individual still frames from 18 hours of high-definition video footage recorded by the Atalanta as it maneuvered through the wreck site. These images were processed through specialized software, Agasoft, Metashape, Professional, that analyzed the images for common features and landmarks, building a point cloud of over 1 million individual data points that define the spatial relationships of every visible feature on the wreck. The software then created surface meshes that connected these points, building a complete 3-dimensional model that could be examined, measured, and analyzed with millimeter precision. The color correction process was equally meticulous. The images had been shot in the absolute darkness of the deep ocean, illuminated only by the artificial lights of the Atalanta. The lighting conditions were harsh and uneven, and the color was severely distorted by the filtered light passing through miles of water. The ENOA team used Adobe Photoshop to individually color correct each of the thousands of images, removing the blue and green color casts that water imparts to underwater photography, restoring the true colors of the rust, the exposed metal, and the preserved paint and markings on the hull. Once the individual models had been completed, 17 separate models in total, covering different sections of the wreck, they were stitched together using Rhinoceros 8, a sophisticated 3D modeling software, to create a complete digital replica of the entire Akagi. This unified model could be rotated, zoomed, measured, and examined from any angle. It could be viewed from above, from the sides, from within the wreckage itself. It could be analyzed by historians, by engineers, by naval architects seeking to understand how the ship had been damaged and how she had ultimately been destroyed. The resulting model was uploaded to Constructed Reality, a platform that allowed researchers and the public to interact with the digital shipwreck in ways that had been impossible before. For the first time in 81 years, people could walk through the Akagi, could examine the damage, could see the wreck exactly as it was at the moment of documentation. The model could be examined by Japanese historians seeking to understand their own naval history. It could be studied by American researchers analyzing the battle. It could be viewed by descendants of the sailors who died aboard the ship, allowing them to see the final resting place of their ancestors. It could be used by educators and documentarians to bring the history of Midway to life for new generations. But the Akagi was not the only wreck that was being documented. In the weeks following the discovery and survey of the Akagi, the team aboard the Nautilus moved to other wreck sites in the same area. The Kaga was located and surveyed. The Yorktown, the American carrier that had been sunk by a Japanese submarine after the initial battle, was also documented. The entire battlefield of Midway, which had been invisible and inaccessible for decades, was suddenly being mapped and measured and preserved in digital form. The significance of this work extended far beyond the historical interest, though that alone was considerable. The digital preservation of these wreck sites was an act of archaeological importance. Underwater wreck sites are constantly degrading, the ocean water is corrosive, the metal rusts, organisms bore into the wood, ocean currents scatter debris, the pressure at extreme depths distorts and eventually destroys structures. The passage of time takes its toll. By creating these high-resolution 3D models, the NOAA team was essentially freezing the wrecks in time, creating a permanent digital record that would exist long after the physical structures had deteriorated beyond recognition. This was particularly important for war graves like the Akagi. Many of the men who died aboard the ship remain entombed within her hull. The deepness of the location and the extreme pressure meant that the US Navy and the Japanese Navy had, by mutual agreement, declared the wreck site a war grave and a memorial site. No disturbance of the wreck was permitted. No salvage operations were undertaken. The Akagi and the other carriers were left undisturbed as monuments to the men who had died aboard them. The digital preservation through photogrammetry allowed researchers and descendants to study and pay respect to these war graves without physically disturbing the sites. The footage from the Atalanta's cameras also revealed details about the Akagi that historians had never been able to confirm before. The white painted lettering of the ship's name on the stern, for instance, had remained surprisingly well preserved despite 81 years of immersion in salt water. The imperial chrysanthemum on the bow, though heavily corroded, was still recognizable. The anchors, the gun mounts, the details of the hull construction, all of these features were now documented in unprecedented detail. Naval historians could study the damage patterns and correlate them with the known bomb impact points from the battle reports, confirming the exact sequence of events as the Akagi had been destroyed. The condition of the wreck also revealed something remarkable about the violence of the battle. This was not a ship that had been lightly damaged and then scuttled by her own crew. This was a ship that had been utterly devastated by the power of modern aerial bombardment. The 100-pound bombs that had struck the Akagi had detonated with tremendous force, tearing through steel plates inches thick igniting secondary explosions from the fuel and ammunition stored below decks. The initial damage from the bomb strikes had been compounded by the uncontrolled fires that had raged through the ship, weakening the structural integrity of the hull through extreme heat. The damage had been so severe that the Japanese destroyers had been able to finish the job with just a few torpedo strikes. This was perhaps the most important lesson that the Akagi's wreck had to teach. It demonstrated conclusively that naval supremacy, even in the hands of what was at the time considered the most powerful naval force in the world, could be overturned by superior tactics, better intelligence, and willingness to take calculated risks. The Japanese had believed themselves to be invincible. Their carrier force had been supreme. Their pilots had been veterans of years of combat experience. Their ships had been well designed and well built. And yet all of this had been rendered irrelevant by the simple fact that the American commanders had known where the Japanese fleet would be and had positioned their own carriers to ambush it. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the US Pacific Fleet, had received intelligence from American codebreakers that the Japanese were planning to attack Midway. He knew the timing, he knew the composition of the Japanese force, and he knew approximately where the Japanese carriers would be. He positioned his own carriers to the north and east of Midway where they could launch their aircraft against the Japanese fleet without being in immediate danger of counterattack. When the Japanese aircraft from the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu attacked Midway in the morning, the American carriers were already aloft and heading toward the Japanese fleet. And the American pilots faced impossible odds. They were flying older aircraft, they were flying at extreme range from their carriers, and they were flying against one of the most powerful and well-trained navies in the world. Many of the American torpedo bombers were shot down without scoring a single hit. The attacks seemed to be failing, but then, just at the moment when the Japanese seemed poised to win the day, the American dive bombers appeared. They came down out of the sun, out of the clouds, appearing suddenly over the Japanese fleet with no warning. The Japanese combat air patrol was either low on ammunition or distracted by the torpedo bomber attacks. The anti-aircraft gunners on the Japanese ships had only seconds to react. The bombs fell, the explosions came, and in 5 minutes, the entire balance of power in the Pacific had shifted. This was the power of intelligence, of tactical advantage, of the willingness to take risks in pursuit of victory. And 81 years later, when the underwater drones descended into the darkness to photograph the wreck of the Akagi, that message was still being delivered. The physical remains of the ship, twisted and broken at the bottom of the ocean, were a testament to the consequences of underestimating an opponent, of failing to adapt to changing circumstances, of clinging to outdated assumptions about naval warfare. The footage from the Atalanta's cameras was transmitted back to the surface through fiber optic cables at the speed of light. Scientists aboard the Nautilus watched in real time as the remotely operated vehicle maneuvered through the wreckage, documenting every detail. They were witnessing history being preserved, history being brought back to the surface from the crushing darkness of the abyss. And as the data streamed back, as the images accumulated, as the three-dimensional model of the wreck began to take shape, the significance of the moment became increasingly apparent. This was not merely a discovery of a sunken ship. This was the documentation of a turning point in world history. This was the preservation of a war grave and a monument to the thousands of men who had died in the battle. This was the creation of a permanent digital record that would allow future generations to understand, to learn from, and to remember one of the most decisive battles of World War II. The wreck of the Akagi represented something far more profound than simply the loss of a ship. It represented the visible, tangible confirmation of what historians and scholars had long theorized but could never definitively prove by direct observation. The balance of power in the Pacific did not shift because of some abstract economic or industrial advantage, It shifted because of a single moment of vulnerability, a single gap in the Japanese defenses, a single window of opportunity that the American commanders saw and exploited with devastating precision. The Akagi, along with her sister ships, represented Japan's entire strategy for the Pacific War. Japan did not have the industrial capacity to outproduce the United States. Japan could not match the sheer numbers of ships, aircraft, and material that American factories could manufacture. Japan's only hope was to achieve a decisive victory early in the war, to destroy the American carrier fleet so completely that the United States would be forced to negotiate peace from a position of weakness. This was Yamamoto's strategy, the grand plan that he had meticulously crafted, and he had failed spectacularly at Midway. After the battle, Japan never recovered. The 4 fleet carriers that sank at Midway represented the trained crews, the experienced pilots, the institutional knowledge of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force. This could not be quickly replaced. Japan could build new ships, and she did build new carriers in the years after Midway, but she could not quickly train the crews to operate them. She could not immediately replace the elite cadre of pilots who had been lost. The United States, by contrast, had the capacity to quickly manufacture new ships and to train new pilots using a systematic program that produced competent aviators in an assembly line fashion. By the end of the war, the Japanese were fielding carrier pilots with only weeks of training and flight time, while American pilots coming from established training pipelines had hundreds of hours of experience. This asymmetry, this fundamental difference in the capacity to replace losses, was what ultimately doomed Japan. Midway was the moment when this asymmetry became irreversible. Before Midway, Japan had the advantage. The Japanese fleet was superior, the Japanese pilots were more experienced, and the Japanese Navy controlled the Pacific. After Midway, that advantage disappeared. The United States seized the initiative and began the long, grinding campaign of island hopping that would ultimately bring American forces to the shores of Japan itself. And Japan, from that moment forward, was always fighting from a position of disadvantage, always trying to maintain the shrinking perimeter of its territorial conquests, always losing ground to the inexorable American advance. The discovery and documentation of the Akagi wreck in 2019 and 2023 allowed modern historians to understand these events at a level of detail that had previously been impossible. The three-dimensional models, the high-definition photographs, the precise measurements of the damage, all of this allowed researchers to correlate the physical evidence with the historical records, to confirm which bombs had struck the ship, to understand the sequence of explosions, to trace the path of the fires as they consumed the vessel from within. It was, in many respects, the final chapter of the archaeological investigation into the Battle of Midway, the moment when the last secrets of the battle were revealed by the physical remains of the ships that had fought it. But the significance of the Akagi's wreck extended beyond the historical record. It was a memorial site, a place where the spirits of the over 200 men who died aboard her could be remembered and honored. In the years following the discovery, both American and Japanese military officials recognized the Akagi wreck site as a war grave, a place of sacred significance that should be preserved and protected. No salvage operations would be conducted. No artifacts would be removed. The wreck would remain undisturbed as a final resting place for those who had died in the battle and as a memorial to all those who had sacrificed their lives in the Pacific War. The footage from the underwater drones, the three-dimensional models, the digital preservation, these things allowed people around the world to see and understand what had happened at Midway without ever having to physically disturb the grave site. The technology of modern underwater exploration had made it possible to honor the dead while simultaneously satisfying the historical curiosity of the living. It was a fitting conclusion to one of the most dramatic and consequential events of the Second World War when you stand back and consider the full arc of the story, from the moment the first American dive bombers screamed down out of the sky on June 4th, 1942, to the moment when the underwater drones captured the first images of the Akagi wreck 81 years later, you are witnessing nothing less than the complete life cycle of a momentous historical event. From the explosive moment of battle, through the slow decades of time passing, to the final revelation of what remained, it is a story of human drama, technological progress, and the enduring significance of history. The Akagi did not just represent a ship. She represented an empire's ambitions. She represented the hopes and dreams of the Japanese military, who believed they could reshape the geopolitical order of Asia and establish a new era of Japanese dominance. She represented the fears of the American military, who recognized that if Japan was not stopped, the entire Pacific would fall under Japanese control. And she represented the courage and sacrifice of thousands of young men who fought and died in a battle that changed the course of history. Today, at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, approximately 1,300 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor, the Akagi lies in the crushing darkness of the abyss, preserved in digital form for all eternity. The wreck that was discovered in 2019 and documented in 2023 will continue to serve as a testament to the power of naval aviation, the fragility of military dominance, and the devastating consequences of modern warfare. It is a place where history was literally buried, and where modern technology allowed us to finally read that history again, more clearly and more completely than ever before. The footage that the underwater drones captured, the three-dimensional models that were created, and the data that was collected have already begun to reshape our understanding of the Battle of Midway. New questions are being asked, new analyses are being conducted, and new insights are being discovered. The Akagi continues to teach us, even in death, even at the bottom of the ocean, even after 81 years of silence. She reminds us of the costs of war, the importance of preparation and intelligence, the capacity for human courage in the face of overwhelming odds, and the way that a single moment, a single decision, a single battle can change the trajectory of world history forever. This is the story of the Akagi. From her commissioning as a proud flagship of the Imperial Japanese Navy, through her role in the attack on Pearl Harbor, to her final burning and sinking at the Battle of Midway, and finally to her rediscovery in the darkness of the deep ocean. It is a story that spans 83 years, crosses an entire ocean, and connects two great nations through a single ship that now serves as a memorial and a testament to one of the most decisive moments in the Second World War. If you found this exploration of the Akagi wreck and the Battle of Midway as fascinating and compelling, like this video and subscribe to our channel. Also check out other thrilling topics like this on this page. Leave us a comment below telling us what aspect of this story moved you the most. We'll see you in the next video.